want to warn those people who have been campaigning our coffee value addition efforts. I need to warn them. They must stop. We know who they are and who are behind them. In the last 60 years, I have been involved in the struggle against this modern slavery for Africa. If you take the whole spectrum of raw materials from agriculture, from minerals, from forest products, etc., the loss to Africa is massive. However, in many sectors, including the coffee sector, we are still losing a lot of money and jobs on account of this distortion. That is why I banned completely, some years ago, the export of unprocessed minerals. I banned them. I'm not popular in some areas. But God is my savior.
For years, a quiet understanding existed behind closed doors, an understanding that one country would continue supplying one of the world's most valuable agricultural commodities, and another would continue benefiting from it without interruption. It wasn't written in any treaty, never spoken aloud in any conference hall, but it shaped global markets all the same. The United States built layers of its coffee industry around that assumption, believing the source was secure, dependable, and permanently tied to the system that favored American buyers. But today that quiet assurance has been shattered. A single decision, delivered with no warning and no negotiation, has completely upended one of America's most sensitive supply chains. And the way it happened is raising far more questions than answers. This wasn't a dispute, it wasn't an argument, it wasn't even a phased reduction. It was a clean break, immediate, final, and deeply symbolic, a line drawn in the sand by a country that has finally decided it will no longer be dictated to, pressured, undervalued, or overlooked. The sudden halt of coffee exports to the United States has become a global shockwave, a moment that analysts in Washington describe as strategically disruptive and insiders in Africa quietly whisper about as long overdue. And behind the public statements, behind the careful diplomatic language, something much larger is unfolding. A silent power shift years in the making. American companies first sensed something was wrong when purchase orders began bouncing. Shipments that were already scheduled for loading were suddenly frozen. Export certificates withheld. Communication went cold. At first there was confusion, then disbelief, and now a simmering panic. You can hear it between the lines of industry briefings, in the sudden spike of emergency conference calls, in the scramble of corporate buyers trying to source alternatives from markets already stretched to their limits, because this isn't just about coffee, it's about leverage, control, and a quiet message being sent across the global South. The age of cheap raw material dependence is ending. For decades, the country at the center of this moment was seen as a peripheral player in the global economy, essential for its commodities, irrelevant in its influence. But while the world looked away, something remarkable was happening. Farmers were organizing, researchers were innovating, leaders were questioning why the wealth generated abroad never matched the poverty at home. A new generation of thinkers and policymakers began pushing for a radical shift. Stop exporting value, start owning it, stop feeding foreign industries, start building local ones, stop accepting low prices, start setting them. This decision, shocking to America but not entirely surprising to those following the region's political mood, is the outcome of that mindset. A deliberate strategic move born from years of frustration with a global market designed to keep producers dependent and buyers comfortable. And now that the comfort has been disrupted, the world's largest economy is staring at a reality it never accounted for. Africa is no longer content with the role it was assigned. What makes this moment so exclusive, so consequential, is not just the scale of the impact, but the timing. Global coffee supplies are already strained. Major producers in Latin America are facing crop failures. Climate pressures are reshaping harvest cycles, and U.S. consumption is at its highest levels in decades. The halt didn't come when America could absorb the hit. It came precisely when the leverage was at its peak. Some say this is coincidence. Others believe it is strategic positioning. Whatever the truth, the effect is the same. America has been caught unprepared. Behind confidential briefings, quiet diplomatic outreach is already underway. Not publicly, no one wants to signal weakness. But the urgency is unmistakable. Because millions of American jobs are connected, directly or indirectly, to the coffee economy. Billion-dollar corporations are built on branding, roasting, and distributing beans they do not grow. Investors are watching nervously as supply chain forecasts darken, and the political class is anxiously calculating how this could spill into inflation, trade tensions, or even legislative battles. But there is another dimension, the psychological one, the realization that a country long dismissed as an economic lightweight can suddenly influence American markets with a single policy decision. That realization is spreading through global institutions, multinational companies, and foreign ministries, and as it spreads, it quietly shifts the assumptions that have governed world trade for generations. Inside Africa, this moment is being framed not as an act of defiance, but as an act of empowerment, a declaration that value will no longer be exported at a loss, a commitment to building industries that keep wealth within the continent, a refusal to remain trapped in a cycle where others profit more from African resources than Africans themselves. To local citizens, it is a bold step toward economic sovereignty. To economists, it is the beginning of a model that could reshape the global commodity landscape. To rival nations, it is a signal that the continent is waking up to its power, and that is what makes this exclusive. The decision is not an isolated event. It is part of a much larger movement that has been quietly growing across the continent. One that could completely rewrite the rules of global trade. The coffee halt is simply the first unmistakable sign. America may treat it as an unexpected blow, but those watching closely understand that this is only the early stage of a deeper realignment. The question now is not whether this will affect the United States, it already has. The real question is how America will respond and whether other countries will follow this lead. Because if this moment becomes a trend, the global economy could be on the edge of one of the most significant power shifts of the century. And it began not with a military alliance, not with a diplomatic treaty, but with a simple, decisive sentence. No more coffee exports. The world is watching. Markets are reacting. And for the first time in a long time, one of the smallest decisions on the global stage has delivered one of the biggest messages. The silence that followed the export halt did not last long. Within days, the shock transformed into something far more consequential, a strategic recalibration across multiple capitals and corporate headquarters. What many initially dismissed as a temporary disruption is now being treated as a signal of a much deeper transformation. And as the world begins to reposition itself, the country at the center of this moment is not retreating. It is advancing, quietly but confidently, rewriting assumptions that once kept it tethered to outdated economic patterns. Act 2 of this unfolding shift is not about the halt itself, it is about the chain reaction that the halt has ignited. Inside the country, the mood has shifted from frustration to determination. The halt has become more than a policy. It has become a statement of identity. Citizens who once questioned whether they had the power to influence global markets are now witnessing the impact firsthand. Local industries are being encouraged to rise, not as replacements for foreign buyers, but as foundations for national economic independence. There is a renewed push toward roasting, packaging, branding, and exporting finished coffee at premium prices, not raw beans that generate wealth only after they leave the soil that produced them. The narrative is changing from dependency to ownership, and the nation feels the weight of possibility pressing forward. Behind the scenes, partnerships that once seemed unlikely are quietly emerging. Investors from regions that have recently strengthened ties with Africa are exploring opportunities that Western companies long ignored or undervalued. Countries seeking influence in Africa's future are expressing interest in supporting processing plants, research centers, and value-added infrastructure. They sense the shift. They recognize that Africa's dominance in raw commodities is evolving into something more potent, control over the entire value chain, and in the midst of this, the nation that halted exports is positioning itself as the continent's example of economic courage. Meanwhile, the United States is confronting its own vulnerability. What began as a supply disruption is now revealing a structural flaw, a flaw that has been hidden beneath decades of foreign reliance. America's coffee giants, known for their dominance and global reach, are suddenly facing the reality that their systems were built on a fragile assumption that producer nations would never challenge the status quo. The shutdown has exposed that assumption as wishful thinking. Crisis meetings within the U.S. coffee industry have become routine, though they are carefully concealed from the public. Procurement teams are hunting for supply sources that can fill the gap, but prices in alternative markets are rising sharply. Countries already dealing with climate challenges are unwilling to expand output too quickly. Some are quietly negotiating their own terms, leveraging the newfound power created by the African halt. It has become clear that the disruption is not isolated, it is contagious. Other producing nations have begun questioning whether they too might demand more respect, more investment, or more control. Diplomatically, the situation is delicate. American officials are aware that pressuring the nation that issued the halt could backfire. Any hint of coercion might reinforce the idea that the United States takes African exporters for granted. Instead, the approach has shifted toward respect, or at least the appearance of it. Offers are being drafted that emphasize partnership, development assistance, and mutual benefit. Yet beneath the diplomatic language lies the urgent truth: the U.S. wants the coffee flow restored not because it values the producer's sovereignty, but because supply chains are tightening around its consumers. On the African side, there is no rush to reopen the pipeline. The halt has granted something far more valuable than foreign revenue. It has granted leverage. Decision-makers understand that reopening too quickly would squander the rare moment when the global system is forced to listen. They are not seeking conflict but recalibration. They want fair prices, equal partnerships, and recognition that the nation's resources are not bargaining chips for foreign industries but assets that must uplift its people. The leverage created by the halt is giving the country the negotiating position it never had before. And yet, even with the tension, something remarkable is happening domestically. For the first time in decades, local entrepreneurs are stepping into spaces once dominated by foreign corporations. Small roasters are expanding, packaging companies are receiving inquiries from new investors, export agencies are evaluating strategies to push premium, finished products into European and Asian markets. The halt is not only a refusal, it is a pivot. A pivot toward a future where the country no longer sees itself as an exporter of raw goods, but as a producer of global brands. International media outlets have begun shifting their tone as well. At first, coverage leaned toward skepticism and shock, framing the halt as a risky move. But as the consequences deepen, the narrative is evolving. Analysts are acknowledging the boldness of the strategy and the logic behind it. Commentators are exploring the growing sentiment across Africa that the continent must stop sending away wealth in its rawest form, and audiences around the world are beginning to understand why this moment is not simply a disruption, it is a correction. Globally, markets are adjusting. Futures traders are recalculating risk. Coffee investors are reassessing which countries hold the real power in the decades ahead. And in boardrooms across the West, a quiet recognition is beginning to form. Africa is not waiting for permission to change its destiny. It is taking action. But the most important transformation is not happening in global markets. It is happening in the minds of the people in the country that made this bold decision for generations. They were told that their role was to supply, that prosperity would come if they stayed within the boundaries set for them. That development would arrive eventually if they continued exporting their best products for others to refine, label, and profit from. Those boundaries have now been erased. The halt has revealed a simple truth: power is not given. It is asserted, and this nation has asserted itself with precision. As Act 2 unfolds, the world is beginning to realize that this moment is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of evolution. A deliberate step toward economic dignity, a recalibration of global trade norms, a reminder that no nation is destined to remain at the bottom of the value chain unless it accepts that position. This country has refused to accept it, and now the question is no longer whether the world will adapt, it is how quickly it can adjust to a new reality where Africa's producers no longer whisper, they lead.